And now we continue with this very exciting journey through time, because we have gone from all the way from medieval to the 21st century, and now we come back or go back in time to the 18th century to talk about the English language and how was the English language in the 18th century in Catalonia and Spain also, and in Barcelona. And our guest is a Catalan born in Canada, who came here many years ago and is a researcher and a university teacher specialized in the English language in the 18th century. Welcome, John Stone.
Well, good evening, and particularly thank you very much for having me. I do a kind of research into cultural history, and what I look at, I call extraterritorial reading. I made up that phrase, so I'll have to sort of tell you what it means. And to tell you what it means, I want to talk a little bit about Jane Austen, because I know you'll all be familiar with her. And then I want to talk a little bit about Stilton cheese, because I expect some of you will have tried Stilton cheese. I know it doesn't sound like it's going to be about books, but really it is. And then finally, I want to talk about a Scottish college that wasn't in Scotland. So I'll start with Jane Austen. It's the year 2015. How many of you have read a Jane Austen book? Right, so hands up. That's, oh, not everybody, but almost everybody. Okay. How many of you have read a Jane Austen book in English, if English is not your mother tongue? Have you tried to read Jane Austen in English? So we've got a few hands going up. Okay. So if we jump back in time 200 years, if we go back to 1815, it's significant because she's published almost all of her great novels. There's only one that had yet to be published. How likely would it be to find someone in Barcelona who had read a Jane Austen book? Not very likely, right? How likely would it be to find anyone in Barcelona who could read a book in English of any kind? A scientific book, or a journal of some kind with political news, right? So that's what I mean by extraterritorial reading. Every language has territory that it's associated with, where it's a language of community use, of culture, and of socialization for children. What happens when you step out of that territory? So what happens if you go to Singapore and you walk into someone's flat, and oh, I've been left without my prop. And you walk up to a wall of books, because they've got a lovely flat, and they've got all kinds of books. And you see that in the wall of books, there's a row that's entirely in Catalan. Oh, what are you doing with all these books in Catalan? Or you walk into a flat in Barcelona, and you find that there's a row of books in Chinese, in one Chinese, because there's more than one Chinese, only one writing system, but more than one language. How can you explain the presence of a literacy that's really uncommon in a place where you wouldn't expect to find it? Now, it's not that far-fetched to say that reading in English in Barcelona or in Spain 200 years ago, 250 years ago, is something like reading Catalan in Singapore today. And I'm sure there are Catalans in Singapore, and I'm sure they have some Catalan books. So their friends walk in and see the Catalan books, can pull them off the shelf, but how many people can read them, right? Mm-hmm. How extraordinary was it? Who were the readers? What did it mean for the readers? And also, what did it mean for the state? Right? There was more than one kind of reader of English in a city like Barcelona 200 years ago. Right? One kind of reader would be someone who brought the language with them. So there's a small community of Anglophones in the city then. There was a somewhat larger community of Francophones in the city. Right? French was the lingua franca, had been all the way through the 18th century. So educated people, cosmopolitan people, accidental cosmopolitans even, like me. I didn't expect to be speaking Catalan and Spanish as an adult. Those people will be expected to know French. They won't be expected to know English. So if they pick up English, why are they going to pick it up? Well, there was a Catalan surgeon by the name of Gimbernat, and he went to England to do some of his training, and he did some training with an anatomist named John Hunter. We all have a bit of anatomy inside of us that's named after Gimbernat. And Gimbernat learned English, and subscribed to journals that were coming from Edinburgh, because Edinburgh was the center, the capital of medical education in English. He was doing that for professional purposes. So you find in major cities, especially in coastal cities, you find little pools of people who, either through trade or often through science, have this early knowledge of English. Right? People who have brought the language with them, who do they tend to be? They can be Irish exiles all the way through the 18th century, because Ireland is a Catholic country under a sort of apartheid regime, where if you're Catholic and you come from an elite background, it's not a good place to be, you might want to leave. And so where do you go? Well, you go to Catholic countries that will accept you, give you sort of rubber stamp and say, okay, walk into our state administration, walk into the military, we'll give you good jobs, all you have to do is change your name around a little bit so that we can pronounce it. I can't give you anecdotes, but marvelous things happen to people with names like McConaughey and Walsh, as those names are Hispanicized. I should be able to remember Walsh. It might come back to me later. Right? I study, in particular, a group of Scottish merchants. It's a network. It's based in Barcelona. It spreads all over Spain. They come here originally to trade in wine. They later trade in fruit. Later they trade in finance, if you can say that. The man who was at the center of this network, his name was Harris. He was an international banker. He had 3 headquarters. One was London, one was Paris, one was Barcelona. He came here and he trained first in Amsterdam, then he came here, lived here for 10 years. He invented the traveler's check, which anyone over 40 will remember. Those of you who are younger than 40, you might not remember traveler's checks. Right? It's before we had electronic money, and people used traveler's checks for 200 years. You could almost say that's a Catalan invention. Right? The third group that I'm interested in is censors. Right? That's to say, the state intervenes and comes along and says, you can't read this book. But what happens if the book is in a language that the state apparatus or the ecclesiastical censors are not familiar with? And would they have been familiar with English? So if the books come in, and how do they come in? They're often coming in diplomatic coaches, and they're underneath Stilton cheese. So you go to the diplomats, you go to the ambassador and say, I want this book, I want that book from London. The ambassador, as a favor, will bring it for you, right?
So come here and we continue talking here. Yes,
yeah?
wow,
Okay.
way back.
Okay.
So yes, I want my tea here with you.
Okay.
So John, it fascinates me about this. What you are saying is that you are just showing us a window to this world of how was Barcelona and Catalonia at that time,
and other cities.
So,
frankly,
how was
I didn't get to my Scottish college that wasn't in Spain. But
well, no, but we will go there.
Yeah.
So, tell me, why these English speakers came to Catalonia?
They came here to make money.
To make money. So
most of them. Okay, if they were Scottish, they came here to make money because they were merchants and they were working in finance.
So this was a place to make money.
One of the founders of Barcelona's first modern bank in the 1770s was Scottish. One was French. And they were here because they could trade with the Americas. They were here because they were working trade networks that took them from the Mediterranean to the British Isles and then to the Americas, where the part of the Americas controlled by Great Britain or by Spain. And as the needs of the population changed, they were importing different things, exporting different things.
What kind of things?
Right? Well, if there was a bad harvest here, they'd be importing wheat from what's now the United States. They were regularly exporting wine, and it was taken either to the Isle of Man, which is between Great Britain and Ireland, or to the Channel Islands, where it would be re-exported in small boats. So essentially, they all begin as smugglers. Mm-hmm. The trade is somewhat illicit. But what's interesting is that the books follow them. In their correspondence, you have people back in Edinburgh saying, okay, do you need any books? Are you bored? You need something to read? And the people I study in the community here in Barcelona will say, well, all the foreigners here share their books. We've got enough books in English and French, and no one seems to bother us.
So you said at the time there was also a censorship for what you can read, which books can enter the kind of...
There's state censorship for publication, so if you want to publish something in Spanish or in Catalan, which was far more unusual, You have to go to the state and ask for a license, right? When you bring books into the country, you're supposed to show them to an ecclesiastical control, so that's a church control, that's going to decide whether the book is admitted or not. If the book is in French, if the book is in Italian, then the censors will be able to read those languages, and they'll be able to recognize names and say, no, you can't have this. But if the books are in English, 9 times out of 10, either the censor just says, sorry, I don't understand that, or there's a little bit of confusion, and then you provide a little bribe. It's easy enough to document that. And the books come in. Or you send them by ship, and you smuggle them off the ship. People of that period wore what were called great coats, which had lots of pockets on the inside. Small books, you just pop them into the pockets. Right? In the last case that I've been studying, I found a Scottish college that was reestablished in a small Castilian city around 1770. And for about a 40-year period, they built up a library that would have been at home in a country house in Scotland. They were getting periodicals. They had over 100 volumes of poetry. They had very little fiction, which is quite sad, but they must have had between 300 or 400 books in English with a strong Scottish emphasis. So it wasn't just a library in English, it was a library in English to represent Scottish intellectual life in the middle of the Scottish Enlightenment. You know, all the big thinkers thinking in the English language in the second half of the 18th century, they're almost all Scottish, right? And in the sciences as well. And I know that by the year 1790, they had people in that city coming to them to learn English.
Wow. And where exactly what, that family, where were there?
No, this Scottish college is not a family thing, it's a church thing.
It's a church thing.
That's the strange thing. The church gives a community of Scottish priests and students a former Jesuit college in Valladolid, in Castile. And they say, okay, you're supposed to train priests who are going to go back to Scotland, which is full of Calvinists, and convert everyone back to Catholicism. And they expect this community of Scots to be unplugged from Scottish intellectual life. But exactly the opposite is true. They're getting and they're reading everything. They're getting Adam Smith, they have David Hume. David Hume was an atheist, he was a notorious atheist.
And who, for example, I imagine physicians also were speaking, I mean, here, or here, surgeons.
The people who knew English would tend to have Irish heritage. If they had Irish heritage, then they'd sort of develop a hybrid culture over several generations. They would keep their English, but they would become Spanish subjects. And very often they would apply to the crown to be recognized as hidalgos, because once they were hidalgos, they could go into state administration, colonial administration, go into the military, etc. Right? But they would keep up their English because it was their bread and butter. They were like normally working in commerce, and what's the advantage that they've got over their competitors? Their advantage is that they can deal with English-speaking markets in what's now the United States, in Great Britain and Ireland. Right? The other people who learn English, that's to say native-born Catalans who learn English, tend to be scientific, occasionally they're military, and then there's some mysterious individuals who may or may not have been of Irish heritage, were working in church institutions and ended up with a book of Shakespeare criticism. Like I found a book of Shakespeare criticism owned by a library in Manresa in the 1760s. I don't know who brought it there. I don't know who was reading it. But it's in English.
Yeah.
If you look at the surviving editions of Shakespeare in Spanish libraries from the period, you would expect them to be French translations, because there are plenty of French translations of Shakespeare. Yes. That's something Franca, cultured people know it. No. The Shakespeare that you find is almost entirely in English.
Wow, very interesting.
And it's a status object too. Some nobles who want to show that they're cosmopolitan will go out of their way to get Shakespeare editions in English, put them on the shelf.
Just as a decoration.
You don't know if they read them or not, or if they were just a decoration. It's like, oh, they really make the room.
And what happened with those families of traders and merchants who were living the Scots and here?
Well, if they wanted to stay, they had to convert to Catholicism if they were not already Catholic. Now, some of the families that I study have connections to the northeast of Scotland, where there was a Catholic minority and a lot of clandestine Catholics. So some of those people might have just said, okay, I'll stay here and be Catholic. I was always Catholic anyway. Right? But some people decide that because their business is going very well, they are going to convert to Catholicism, change their name. One of the early Shakespeare translators into Castilian, not into Catalan, Catalan comes much later, is a man named Macpherson, Guillermo Macpherson, and his father was either a Douglas or a Duncan Macpherson. He was a Scottish merchant. He decided to convert. He stayed, so his son grew up speaking English and Spanish, and then 40 years later you get a Shakespeare translator. You don't get any direct translation of literature from English into Spanish until 1798 for a full-length book.
So now I'm remembering that Slave, who came, the autobiography of slaves.
Yes.
Tell us that story, very interesting.
Yeah, well, this is a Nigerian who was probably born in the 1740s, and he was kidnapped from his kingdom. He said his father was a local king, and taken to the coast, sold on, sold again, finally sold to traders, taken to the West Indies, and passed through the hands of 3 or 4 masters in the West Indies. He was bright. He taught himself to read and write very quickly. He taught himself accounting. So he became a sort of administrative slave rather than someone working in the fields.
And he came to Barcelona.
Yes, then he was bought by a captain in the Royal Navy, or a lieutenant rather. And he became sort of a house slave on a Royal Navy ship. The biggest Royal Navy ships could be like small towns, 800 people on a ship.
Wow.
Or what was called a ship of the line. Absolutely massive. This is in the late 1750s, and Spain was still neutral in a war between France and Britain. Right? So they had been in the part of Canada where my parents are from, at the siege of an important fortress, and then 8 months later, the same ship, the same people, including the slave, Ulada Equiano is his name, they come into Barcelona, and he has a wonderful time, and he says that the people here are very nice.
And how we know that he said that?
It's in his autobiography.
Oh, he wrote an autobiography.
He wrote an autobiography, which is it's a polemic about slavery, and it's part of a movement in the 1790s to have slavery abolished. And the slave trade was abolished in 1807. So people had been working towards that for about 20, 30 years, really. And he was, part of a group of political activists. Like Obama was a professional political activist before he went into electoral politics. This man, who had been a slave, became a professional lecturer. He went around to different towns in Great Britain and Ireland, giving talks on slavery to help persuade people. And the book that he used to convince people was his autobiography, and it talks about his visit to Barcelona as an early teen.
Wow, this is really amazing. And now I'm thinking, how did we go from there, that the English being like a language that was secondary or tertiary, completely marginal, until now? So when Catalans or people in Catalonia start to actively studying or having present language as an important language?
Well, this is anecdotal for me. If I look at the history of translation, there are people translating from English into Catalan in a big way by the 1920s, and there's a small urban population for whom English is the second foreign language. These are consistently people who learn French and then they move on to English, or other people will learn French and then move on to German. But it's a tiny, tiny, tiny group. The shift in the Catalan education system really comes in the 1980s. Until then...
It's very, very recent.
Very recently. Until then, you went to secondary school, and it was expected that you would study French. And beginning at the end of the 1980s, early 1990s, the shift had gone over to English. English was the predominant foreign language in Catalan education. So it's
very new.
It's in the lifetime of almost everyone I know.
Yes, it's very new. Oh, that's very interesting, and I think we can continue talking about language and the use of language with with our previous guests. What do you think?
Sure.
Thank you very much for your And now we continue with this very exciting journey through time, because we have gone from all the way from medieval to the 21st century, and now we come back or go back in time.
With political news, right? So that's what I mean by extraterritorial reading. Every language has territory that it's associated with, where it's a language of community use, of culture, and of socialization for children. What happens when you step out of that territory? So what happens if you go to Singapore and you walk into someone's flat, and oh, I've been left without my prop. And you walk up to a wall of books, because they've got a lovely flat and they've got all kinds of books, and you see that in the wall of books there's a row that's
to the 18th century to talk about the English language and how was the English language in the 18th century in Catalonia and Spain also, and in Barcelona. And our guest is a Catalan born in Canada, who came here many years ago and is a researcher and a university teacher specialized in the English language in the 18th century. Welcome, John Stone.
So, good evening, and particularly thank you very much for having me. I do a kind of research into cultural history, if English is not your mother tongue, have you tried to read Jane Austen in English? So we've got a few hands going up. Okay. So if we jump back in time 200 years, if we go back to 1815, it's significant because she's published almost all of her great novels. There's only one that had yet to be published. How likely would it be to find someone in Barcelona who had read a Jane Austen book? Not very likely, right? How likely would it be to find anyone in Barcelona who could read a book in English of any kind? A scientific book, or a journal of some kind. I call extraterritorial reading. I made up that phrase, so I'll have to sort of tell you what it means. And to tell you what it means, I want to talk a little bit about Jane Austen, because I know you'll all be familiar with her. And then I want to talk a little bit about Stilton cheese, because I expect some of you will have tried Stilton cheese. I know it doesn't sound like it's going to be about books, but really it is. And then finally, I want to talk about a Scottish college that wasn't in Scotland. So I'll start with Jane Austen. It's the year 2015. How many of you have read a Jane Austen book? Right, so hands up. That's, oh, not everybody, but almost everybody. Okay. How many of you have read a Jane Austen book in English